What is going on, guys? Welcome back to another Swift video. In today's video, we're going to be taking a pretty deep look at how to use an API, and this is entirely from a beginner's perspective. So here's an app we're going to make. It's a photo search app. So in the search bar up here, we're going to start by, let's say, typing nature, maybe, and we're going to try to spell things correctly. I'm going to hit enter, and we'll see a bunch of nature-related photos load in here. We'll talk about, how to call an API, how to change it into things like images here, and we can even change it and search for something else. Let's go ahead and search for airplane here, and we'll see that a bunch of airplane-related photos pop up. So that all said, let's get started by destroying the like button for the YouTube algorithm. Hit subscribe if you're new to the channel, get Xcode ready, get pumped. Let's talk about some APIs in your iOS apps. Quick pause before the video. This video is brought to you by iOSacademy.io. Head on over to check out the newly launched TikTok and SwiftUI courses. Learn to build world-class professional apps in a fraction of the time, quickly and efficiently. That said, let's get back to the video. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started by opening up Xcode and creating a brand new project here. We're going to stick with the app template under iOS, and we're going to go ahead and call this project Photo Search. Once you do that, make sure your language here is Swift and your lifecycle is in fact UIKit. Go ahead and continue. We'll save this onto our desktop. And the first thing we're going to do is expand our Xcode window, close this right panel, and jump into our view controller file here where we're going to write all of our code. And I'm also going to hit the play button at the top left to build and load up our app into our simulator here. So cool, now that we've got that good to go, the next thing we want to do is actually find an API to use. So I have got the Unsplash API opened up here. It's a free API where you can search for images. I'm going to link it down below, but if you head on over to Google and just search for Unsplash API, you can go and create a free account and register an application here. We've called it Photo Search, and once you register an application, you'll get all this information about it, but we're going to want to scroll down to the section that has our key and our secret. So let's see, I think I passed it somewhere here. Here it is, our access key and our secret key. These two pieces of information are going to be used when we make our API calls to identify, which application is using the API. The second tab that I've got opened here is the API documentation, and Unsplash has some pretty great documentation here, but what we're going to go ahead and use on the left-hand side, if we scroll, there's a bunch of different API endpoints, but we're going to use search photos. And if we just go through the literature here, we can see that the URL takes a bunch of optional parameters, but actually they have a nice example right here that I've got highlighted where you would call basically api.unsplash.com/search photos, etc., etc. And this third tab that I've got here is an example URL, which also has our client ID inside of it. So I'm going to call it, rather copy it, and I'm going to paste it at the top of our view controller here. And we're going to look at it and take a look at the various components. So I'm going to call this a URL string, and we'll paste this in here. And if we start looking at it, the first part of this is basically the API URL. Then we've got a bunch of parameters. So we're saying page 1. We can pass in a query of what photos we'd like to go ahead and search. And then here we are passing in the client ID, which is our access key from this first tab we took a look at here. So this is basically the URL that we're going to call. And when we call this URL, we're going to get a bunch of JSON data back. And what we want to actually do is be able to get this data into our app, and we're going to somehow parse these into objects that we can use in the app. And in this case, we want to pull out from the URLs here, we're going to pull out the full image URL, and that's going to go ahead and be a URL to the photo we found. So cool, that all said, let's start writing some code. It's a lot of theory, but let's take a look at how we want to go and do this. So the first thing we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to create a function that's going to be called fetch photos. And in here, we want to go ahead and make a network call to this URL. So hypothetically, we can make the URL dynamic. Right now we're querying for, office photos, and we can let the user type in any search word, search term, and, pass that in. But let's start off with the bare basics. So we're going to come in here and create a URL session dot shared, and we want to create a data task with a URL and a completion handler. And we want to stick with this one here. And the first thing we want to do is convert our URL string from up above into a URL object. So we're going to say guard let URL is a URL where we pass in our string. And the reason we need to bind it in a guard let statement here is our string might be just completely malformed and invalid. So that wouldn't be a valid URL object. So now that we have that URL passed in, we have a completion handler here. And this closure will return to us data from the other side of the network call, a URL response, which we're going to pass in an underscore here because we're going to ignore it. Our data actually will contain the bytes we get back. The response naming is a little misleading. And the last thing here we get is an error, which will be optional, if something goes wrong. So in our closure, we're going to unwrap the data and make sure we got something, and then we're going to unwrap, we're going to validate the error is nil, implying that something didn't go wrong or we're good to go. Now that we have a task created, to kick it off, we're going to say task.resume. And what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm just going to add a print statement here, and we are going to say got data. Let's go ahead and give this a run, but before we do that, we want to call this fetch photos right here at the bottom of view did load. And let's go ahead and run it in a simulator, and let's make sure we're getting our print statement out. And once we do that, we can focus on the next piece. So cool, so down here in our console, we have got data printing. So that means our network call is definitely successful. The next thing we want to do is basically convert that data, which actually comes back in the form of bytes, into this JSON structure that we see here. It's a dictionary key value pairs. And the way we can do that is by using this really cool thing built into Swift called codable. So we're going to create a struct that is called API response, and we're going to say it conforms to the codable protocol. And in here, we basically want to specify the same keys that are in our actual response. So total, total pages, and results. Now we also want to make sure the types match. So Swift basically will take, whatever the names are in here and the types, and it's going to try to convert the data into this basically one-to-one. So let's make sure we type it all correctly. We have total, total pages, both of those are ints, and then we have results, which points to an array of these result objects. So let's go ahead and create a result, which is an array of results, I guess we can go ahead and call it. And results, I believe this one was plural. Result here is going to be another struct, which is codable. Now, it's okay to omit some of the keys. You don't need to necessarily add every single one because that would take forever. The things that we are going to add, I guess we can do the ID. So let's say let ID, which looks like it was a string since it was in quotes for the value here. And we care about the photo URL. So I'm going to create URLs. And this is going to be another struct. We're just going to care about the full, which points to another string. So we are going to say let URLs will be URLs. URLs is going to be another struct. Once again, codable, and we just care about full. We're going to ignore everything else. And now that we have these structs that we want to basically take the data and convert it into once we get it back from our API call, what we can do is we can use something called JSON decoder to do that. So instead of printing here, what I'm going to go ahead and do is create a do catch statement. And we are going to say let result is going to be JSON decoder. And we're going to basically say try to decode the data into one of our API response models. And it's basically just a struct up here. And what Swift is going to do, it's going to try to look at the keys and the types and try to convert everything in the JSON to that. And if something goes wrong, we're just going to print out an error here. But if something doesn't go wrong, what I'm going to go ahead and do is we will print out results dot let's see, results.results.count. And maybe I'll go ahead and say, let's go ahead and call this JSON results so we don't have any confusion in our naming. So if we go ahead and hit Command R now, once again, looks like we have an error here. Let's take a quick look at what's going on. Let's see, we would need to prefix this JSON decoder with the word try. This call can actually throw an error, hence we put it in a do catch statement. Go ahead and hit Command R to build and run. In our console now, we should see something printed out. So it looks like we have 10 of these results coming back. So we probably want more than that. So let's go back to our API documentation here. And if memory serves, there is a parameter we can add, which is per page. If we take a look here, it's the number of items per page, and it defaults to 10. So we want more than that to come back. So let's go ahead and add this per page to our URL string here. It's going to be a get parameter. So I'm going to stick it right here in front of page equals 1. We're going to say per page is 50. That way we'll get 50 results back. Let's go ahead and run it and make sure we actually get 50. All right, let's say we got 30, which is probably the API's limit per call. So cool, now that we have those, let's go ahead and let's talk about how we would present these on the UI. So the first thing I'm going to go ahead and do is we probably want to save this as a global property so we can go ahead and access it in our UI update code. So we want to save basically an array of result objects like this. So I'm going to take that and we're going to stick it right up here. It's going to be a var, and by default, it'll be empty. Once we get the data back, we are going to say self.results equals JSON results.results. Now we don't want to cause a memory leak, so we are going to say weak self here at the beginning of the closure. If you're not familiar with weak references, take a look at my other videos about it. But we'll add a question mark here because it's self optional now. And I'm also going to go ahead and wrap this in a dispatch queue main async call, which is how we want to always update our UI since we'll be on the main thread. Now we don't really have any UI yet, of course. If we take a look at our app, it's totally empty. So we want to basically present all of our images here in some type of UI. Now what I'm going to go ahead and do is we are going to create a basic collection view here, which is kind of out of scope for the networking and API aspect of the video, but just bear with us. We're going to create a private collection view right here, and it's going to be of type UI collection view optional. And I'm going to go ahead and set this up directly in our view to load function. We're going to create another collection view here instead of using that optional one. And I'll show you guys why in just a moment. And we're going to create it with a frame of 0 and the layout of layout. We're going to create the layout right above this. It's going to be a UI collection view flow layout, just like that. And this layout can specify basically how big every cell is and the direction it's going to scroll and all that good stuff. So we're going to say scroll direction is vertical. We'll say the minimum line spacing is 0. And I'm also going to say the minimum inter item spacing is 0. And finally, we're going to say the item size here is going to be CG size. And let's say 200. Let's actually do it dynamically. Let's go ahead and say this is going to be view.frame.size.width divided by 2. And the height will be the same, so it's a nice square image. And let's see, once we've gone ahead and done that, we want to go ahead and add this as a subview. We're going to say view, add subview, the collection view, and then we're going to assign that collection view to our global property of collection view. The reason we use another instance here is so we don't have to deal with the fact that this thing is optional. So before we go ahead and add this as a subview, I'm also going to assign its data source to self. Now you'll see an error on this line because we haven't conformed to the data source. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to say UI collection view data source, just like that. Now this data source has a number of required functions, I believe 2. So we're going to say number of items in our collection view. We're going to return the number of results that we have. And keep in mind this results thing that we're referencing here is our array of results. And by default, it'll be 0. The next thing we want is cell for item at index path. And in here, we need to dequeue a cell and return it. So we're going to say cell is a collection view, dequeue reusable cell with an identifier and index path. So we are going to use, let's see, this one right here. We haven't registered anything to our collection view yet. So we'll say cell, index path, and we are going to return. And just for the sake of, just starting off, we're going to set a background color to this cell. I'm going to say it is blue. And let's see, we also want to register that cell. We used a string here for the identifier. We also want to return the cell to the function, so we get rid of that error. Now to register a cell, we are going to come up here and say collection view. And we are going to register a UI collection view cell.self for the identifier of cell. And once our API call comes back, which is all of this stuff, after we have updated our results, since we're reassigning it here, we're going to say self.collection view. We're going to go ahead and say reload data. The reason we're saying reload data now is because we have updated our results, which we have, as a global property up here. When we reload our data, our number of cells should now reflect the new number of things in results, and our number of actual blue squares that we see should also reflect it. So I'm going to hit Command R to build and run, and we're going to take a look at these blue, hopefully squares showing up. And the reason they're actually not showing up is because I forgot to do something super important, and that is give a frame to our collection view here. So we have not implemented a frame for it, and all of this stuff is in view.did_load. So we want to go ahead and override view.did_layout subviews, and I'm going to say super view.did_layout subviews, and I'm going to assign our global collection views frame size to be the entirety of the controller's view frame. And we should end up seeing some blue squares. All right, looking pretty good. So we see a bunch of these blue squares. It's kind of hard to see where one starts and the other, begins because we don't have any spacing between them. But we didn't come here to see blue squares. We want to see our actual images. So what we need to now do is we need to basically have a custom cell here to which we can pass our result URL, and where we can actually download that image and show it in the cell. So that actually brings us to the second part of API calling, which is how do you download an image from a URL? So when we say cell for row, cell for item at index path here, we can actually get the relevant result out of the results collection. So we're going to say from results, give me index path.rows elements. From that, we want to get URLs, and then from that, we're going to get the full URL. So we can actually call this URL string. We can call this image URL string. But now we want to create a custom collection view cell that actually has an image view in it where we can show that particular image. So we're going to come up here and create a brand new file, and it's going to be a Cocoa Touch class, and we want to subclass a UI collection view cell, and I'm going to go ahead and call it image collection view cell. Make sure your language is Swift and go ahead and create it. The first thing that we want to actually do in here is create a static let property called identifier. And similar to how we used the string for cell in our view controller here, not only to dequeue it right on this line, as well as registering it up here, what I think is a really good practice is just create that as a string in here. I like to use the same name as the class. That way you can ensure you don't have any typos in the string. The next thing you want to do is override the initializer, which has a frame, and call super init with the frame, just like that. You'll also need to bring in the required initializer for this class. Not really relevant why you need this, kind of out of scope, but go ahead and add those. We'll also need layout subviews, call super layout subviews. You're going to need to override prepare for reuse, say super prepare for reuse, and the final function we'll need to create on here is configure with URL, which will be a string. So let's talk about each of these components. So we have initializers here, but we don't have any image view in this cell yet. So we're going to declare an image view here. We're going to say private let image view is a UI image view, and we're going to create it with this anonymous closure pattern, which allows us to configure all of our properties stuff directly in this curly brace block. So we're going to say it's a UI image view. We'll return it here. And we're also going to say that it clips to bounds, so nothing overflows. And I'm also going to say its content mode is going to be scale aspect fill. Now, once we've gone ahead and created an image view here, we want to definitely add it as a subview, but we're going to add it to the content view. That's kind of a relevant detail of any type of cell. So let's continue along instead of focusing on that for a moment. We want the image view's frame to be the entirety of this cell's content view. So we're going to say its frame equals content view.bounds. Now in prepare for reuse, this is the function that gets called every time the cell prepares to be reused, hence the name. And finally, this is the most important function. This is the function we're going to call from our view controller where we pass in the URL for the image. So the first thing we want to do is create our image URL from the string. We can actually even call this URL string. We can say guard-let URL is a URL object with a string of URL string. And if we're not able to create it, we're going to go ahead and return. And now we want to use a network task to actually download the byte for this image. So we're going to say a task is a URL session shared, and we're going to say data task. That's going to have a URL and completion. URL, completion takes data. We're going to ignore the second HTTP response, and then optionally it also has an error in case something goes wrong. We are going to want to unwrap the data. Since it might be nil, we're going to validate that the error is in fact nil. And once we have this, we can actually create an image with this data. But we want to do that on the main thread because the image is actually part of a UI, a UI object. So we want to say an image is a UI image, and we're going to create it with some data, and we can pass in data just like that. And finally, we're going to assign this to our image view. So we'll say the image view's image is our image. And because once again, we're in a closure, we want to go ahead and say weak self here and make this self optional. And don't forget to say task.resume to actually begin this URL session task. One other thing you could do is just get rid of this task assignments, and you can just say .resume at the end of this block. Both are totally acceptable. So cool, now what we need to do is actually call this configure function and register the cell back in our controller. So we're going to come back to our view controller, and at the top here where we registered this vanilla collection view cell, we're going to register our custom cell.self with our class name .identifier, which if you recall was that static property we added. If we click jump to definition, we'll see it right back here. And now that we registered it, we also want to use this. So in the cell for item at index path, we want to use our new identifier. We want to try to cast this cell as our custom cell. And we are going to say guard let in case we are unable to cast it. We are going to fall back to a normal UI collection view cell. You should not have any problems casting it. But let's see, if we're not able to do that, we'll fall back there. Otherwise, what we're going to say is we can now say here, cell.configure, because we have casted our cell to our image collection view cell, we now have access to that custom configure function we wrote, and we can pass in our image URL string just like that. And if you recall back in our configure function, we take that URL, we try to convert it to a URL object, and then we pass it into another networking call here to download the image data for the URL, and then we stick it into the image views image. So let's go ahead and hit Command R. We wrote a ton of code, and let's make sure that works. All right, bear with it. We should see our images load up here in a moment. There's one, two. Now you can see they're asynchronous, so it's a little slow as they do in fact load in. Some of them are faster than others, some are significantly slower. We are actually getting the full image here. So if we look at the JSON, it probably has lower images too. Here we have small and thumbnail. We can also do regular if we wanted, but we have this working now. And as we scroll, you can see here actually that it's loading in the other images too. One thing you'll notice is if you actually try scrolling back up, what's going to happen is it's going to try to load those images in again. And the reason for that is we're not caching the images as we have downloaded them, scrolled the cell off screen, then scroll them back. Caching is a whole other video, and I want to keep this focused to the API call. But the takeaway here is we're going to the network, we're fetching this JSON from this API, and then we have a way now to convert it into these images and then download that image as well from the URL. So let me go ahead and let's add one more thing to our app here before we wrap up. And that is a way to search for different images because these office photos are nice, but we could probably do a little better than this. Now, before we do that, I'm going to actually, instead of using the full image here, I'm going to change this to use the regular image so they load in a little faster. So we're going to come into this, and instead of full here, we're going to do regular. And we also need to remember in our cell for row, or rather cell for item, we want to change this to be regular as well. Go ahead and give it a Command R to build and run, and your photos should hopefully load in a little faster now that they're not as large. You can also go with the thumbnail image here or small in our JSON. We're just sticking with regular. So cool, how do we actually allow the user to search? It's pretty simple. What we want to go ahead and do is we want to add a search bar at the top of our app here. So what we're going to do is we are going to declare a search bar, which is a UI search bar, just like that. We're going to add it as a subview at the top of view did load, like so. And we also want to go ahead and assign the search bar's delegate to self, and we want to conform to that protocol. And the reason we need the delegates is because there's a function on there that we can call that gets called rather when the search button gets clicked. And let's see, search clicked, if we take a look at this, there's a function in here called search bar search button clicked. When we actually go ahead and get the click event here, we want to actually fetch photos. So right now we're fetching photos, as soon as the app launches and view did load, I'm going to delete that. And what I want to say here is we're going to say fetch photos, and it's going to have a parameter of query. And we're going to take this query parameter, and what I'm going to go ahead and do is instead of using this URL string global thing here, I'm going to grab this whole URL and do a Command X to cut it, and we're going to come down to that function, and instead of using the word office in the string here for the query, we're actually going to stick in the parameter that comes into the function, thus making it dynamic. So once we have done this, what we want to do is we're going to say if let text is the search bar dot text, just like so. What we can go ahead and do is we can say fetch photos for this text. And before we do that, we are going to make sure we empty out our results. We are also going to reload data on our collection view so we can go in, remove the photos from the prior one, from the prior search term. And this should go and kick off another API call. Finally, we want to give our search bar a frame. So right here in view did layout subviews, we're going to want to tweak this a little bit. So I'm going to say search bar, and we want to give it a frame just like the collection view. So we're going to say CZ rect, and here we're going to say this is 10 from the left, and from the top here, we want to use the safe area. So I'm going to say this is safe area insets.top. This will be the width of the entire view. So we'll say view.frame.size. Let's Let's try that one more time. Frame size dot width, subtracting 20 because we said 10 from the X side, which is the left, and the height is going to be 50. And our collection view now is going to be cgrect, and this is going to be 0 from the left. We're going to say view.safeAreaInsets.top plus 55, so it's not overlapping our search bar. The width will be view.frame.size.width, so it's the entirety of the width of the screen. And finally, our height is going to be view.frame.size.height, subtracting 55. All right, once we have done that, there's one thing I forgot to do, and that's when this search button is clicked, we want to get rid of the keyboard on the search bar. So we're going to say search bar, resign first responder. So we've written a ton of code here. Let's go ahead and run it, and let's see what we've got going on. And if everything is functioning, we'll do a quick recap. So right now we have this black empty screen here and a search bar up here. You might be wondering, why do we have a black screen? Because we had a white background in the beginning. And the reason is, we can actually fix it, is the default background color of our collection view is black. So I'm going to say our collection view's background color is going to be system background, which for those of you who don't know will be white in light mode and black in dark mode. And we have our search bar up here that we can tap in. Now, if you see the cursor but not your keyboard, you need to come up here to your toolbar and hit IO, keyboard, and you want to toggle the software keyboard, and you'll see the keyboard pop up like that. And let's say we want to search for images of ocean. Type in ocean, go ahead and hit enter, and it should kick off a API call. And what you'll notice here is we get a bunch of pictures of the ocean. And we can scroll down and it'll load in the other pictures. Let's scroll back up here. Let's search for something else. So I'm going to delete all of this, and we're going to search for mountains and hit enter, and boom, we have a bunch of mountains. So let's do a quick recap here of the search behavior and then the whole thing, because we did write quite a bit of code. So to get the search functionality working, we basically added the search bar here. At the top of view.load, we set its delegate so we can get the event when the user hits the enter key. We add it as a subview. Now in view.layout subviews, we adjusted the framing for the search bar and the collection view so we can fit both of them on the screen. When the search button is clicked, we call this function. We get rid of the keyboard by telling the search bar to resign as the first responder. We unwrap the text from the search bar in case the user, just entered a bunch of spaces. And if we have text, we reset the result in collection view and call this fetch photos and pass in the query text. Now we also move the URL string locally into this function so we can dynamically stick in the query term into the string. Now we also then go ahead and make an API call via URL session with a URL and a completion closure. We learned about codable and creating those struct models from the data we get back with this do catch and our JSON decoder. And then down here, we have a bunch of collection view stuff, which is pretty unrelated to the API business, but that's how we actually render out this nice grid of photos. For the images in each cell, we did need to create a custom collection view cell here, which is a subclass of a collection view cell. We have a cell ID. We have an image view in here. We are laying everything out. And then the important thing is we added this configure function that can take in a URL string for an image. It converts it to a URL object, and it can go ahead and create a session task to convert that URL, get the data from it, and convert it into an image. So that is an API in a nutshell. And what's really important, once again, takeaways from our browser over here is your codable models need to match basically the keys, which is the keys over here on the left-hand side of all the colons, and the types need to match too. So total would be the key, the type would be an integer. Most APIs have pretty good documentation. Unsplash is a really good one to get started because it's A, fully free. B, they have a pretty extensive API with a bunch of different things you can do here, and C, it's very well documented. And of course, all APIs will have some sort of authorization, some type of key. Here's an access key or a secret key. You definitely don't want to be sharing these with anybody. Of course, I'm sharing it for the purpose of this video. I'll probably deactivate these keys after the video goes up. So definitely head on over to unsplash.com and create your own application keys and account. So that's basically all I've got for you guys. Fully functional API-driven photo search app here. Let's search for one more thing. Let's search for YouTube and let's see what we get. Searching for YouTube, and boom, we have a bunch of YouTube related images. So once again, hope you guys found this video helpful. It definitely covered a lot. Leave a comment down below if you're confused on anything, if you have questions. I love helping you guys out as much as I can. If you haven't liked the video yet, make sure you destroy that like button for the YouTube algorithm. And most importantly, hit subscribe for daily Swift uploads and to join the iOS Academy community. Thanks for watching. I'll see you all in the next one.